Hey guys, tonight we begin with the crack of bone, the seep of blood, and the slow, deliberate hand of a man holding scissors in one hand and a cauterizing iron in the other. This is not a tale of medicine as you know it. Tonight we drift through the world of the barber surgeons, men who sliced, stitched, and sawed before understanding what germs were. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what time it is for you and where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It always started with the pain, dull at first, then sharp, then so consuming that your breath shortened and your hands wouldn't stop trembling. It could be a rotting molar, a festering cut, or a splinter gone too deep. And there were no hospitals, no trained doctors within reach. Only a wooden chair, a basin, and the man who shaved your neighbor that morning and would amputate a leg before supper, the barber surgeon. He didn't wear white. His apron was brown, stained, and stiff with old blood. He didn't ask for your name, just pointed, and you sat. No questions, no reassurance, just the smell of iron, sweat, and the faint sourness of things that had died too slowly. You knew it would hurt. Everyone said it would. But no one ever quite described the sound. The crack of tooth against metal. The way the body thudded when it passed out mid-scream. The way they sometimes didn't wake up. The tools weren't clean. They were warmed by fire, wiped with rags, sharpened by guesswork. He worked fast. He had to. Too slow and you might bleed too much. Too careful and the infection had time to deepen. So he pulled, sliced, burned. Whatever stopped the pain, or replaced it with something worse. You didn't go because you trusted him. You went because there was no one else. The church might pray for you. The apothecary might hand you leaves. But only the barber would cut the limb, drain the abscess, pull the worm from your tooth. And yes, they believed in worms. Tiny creatures chewing through enamel like rats through cellar beams. You didn't argue. You just hoped whatever he pulled from your jaw would stop the ache. When it was over, you didn't thank him. You didn't speak at all. You just stumbled away, dizzy from blood loss and shame, clutching a cloth to your face, hoping you wouldn't die before the next frost. The bleeding didn't stop right away. You sat outside the shop, head tilted, pressing the cloth tighter with each passing second. It was cold now, stiff with drying blood, and you had no more to give. No one offered to help. They walked past quickly, eyes lowered, hoping not to hear the soft moan leaking from your throat. You weren't the first to sit there that day. You wouldn't be the last. Behind you, inside, the barber was already lifting another body onto the chair. Someone older, someone quieter, someone missing 2 fingers already. The stool hadn't even cooled from your warmth before he began again. You tried to walk home, but the world tilted. The ground seemed softer than it should, and your knees felt hollow, like wood too long in the rain. The cobblestones pressed up through your boots. The blood had soaked through the bandage and stained your collarbone, mixing with the crust from yesterday's meal. You could still taste the iron. It clung to your teeth, coated your tongue, made every breath feel like you were swallowing coins. They said it would get better, but no one meant soon, and sometimes it didn't. Barber surgeons weren't trained. They were inherited. You took over when your father's hands shook too much to hold the blade. You learned not by reading, but by cutting. Pigskin first, then drunkards, then children. No one ever volunteered. They simply had no choice. If the wound festered, it had to be opened. If the bone snapped, it had to be set. And if the pain lasted more than 3 nights, something had to be removed. Not because it would save you, but because it might silence you. There was a rhythm to it. The scraping of metal on wood as instruments were laid out, the hiss of the iron as it heated, the muttering of prayers, not yours, his. He asked for steadiness, not forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive. Pain was the process. Screaming was expected, and silence, real, sudden silence, was how you knew he'd gone too deep. But he didn't flinch. He just wiped the blade and called in the next soul. Teeth were the most common. Everyone had them. Everyone lost them. By 30, most mouths were empty. Gums blackened from rot. Tongues chewed raw by uneven stubs. They said chewing with your lips helped. They lied. Bread tore your mouth. Meat was impossible. So you soaked everything in weak beer until it dissolved. That or you didn't eat. You died smaller. But teeth were nothing next to limbs. A broken leg was a sentence. First to bed, then to fever, then to a visit from the barber. He'd bring the saw. Not sharp, never clean, but heavy. He'd press your arm against the table, hand you a stick to bite, and nod. That was all. No words. Then the pull, the slice, the scream. If he was fast, you passed out before the bone snapped. If he wasn't, you remembered every second. And when you woke, there was less of you. Always less. Barber surgeons didn't wear white because they'd never keep it clean. They didn't smile because they knew what they did. And they didn't stop working because people didn't stop suffering. You might hate him. You might curse him. But when the rot came back, you knocked on his door. Because you always did. There were no clean rooms, no antiseptic, no sterilized tools laid out under flickering lights. Just a bench, a basin, and a bucket for the blood. If you were lucky, the barber wiped the knife between patients. If you weren't, your wound met the same edge that had opened a pig's belly 2 hours earlier. Infection wasn't understood. It was expected. And when the swelling began, hot, red, aching, you didn't blame him. You blamed yourself for not healing faster. Some said garlic helped. Others stuffed the wound with moss or chewed bark. You'd heard of someone who rubbed ash into the cut and swore it drew out the poison. The truth was simpler. You either survived or you didn't. The body either fought or it failed. And if it failed, the barber came back to finish the job. He didn't flinch. He had a cart of remedies, knives for cutting, hooks for fishing out fragments, leeches in a jar, a red-hot rod for sealing the flesh, and a stick for you to bite when it started. He wasn't a doctor. Doctors didn't touch blood. They read books, smelled of ink and dried herbs, and only visited nobles. But the barber, he was in every alley, every slum, every place pain hid itself. You knew his boots by sound, the scuff of leather through puddles. You knew his cough, rough from smoke and long nights without rest. You knew the way he muttered under his breath, never loud, always just loud enough to hear the word hold. And then the blade came. If he had apprentices, they were boys too poor to refuse. They didn't learn with dolls. They learned by holding legs still while the saw moved. They wiped tears from strangers and vomit from the floor. They learned to keep their mouths shut when the client started convulsing, and to pull the tourniquet tight enough to hold, but not so tight that the limb split. These boys grew up quickly, or they didn't grow up at all. And not all operations were done in homes or shacks. Sometimes they were done in public, under bridges, at market squares, where there were benches and buckets and straw, where people walked past with turnips and didn't look, where blood flowed between cobblestones and dried under horse carts. You'd sit in the open, you'd scream into your own hands, and no one stopped. Because it was normal. Because pain was daily. Because if they watched, they might be next. There were stories of barbers with steady hands, famous ones, men who could pull a tooth in one swift motion or set a broken arm with a single jerk. But you hadn't met them. You only knew the one with a limp and a cough and a nervous twitch in his left eye. He drank from a flask between patients. He wiped his blades with rags that never looked clean. He'd once removed a fishhook from your cousin's neck and left a scar shaped like a question mark. The cousin didn't talk much after that. Barber surgeons weren't trusted. They were tolerated, like rats in the wall or smoke in the chimney. You needed them. You hated them. And when you dreamed, you often saw them. Hands red, sleeves stiff, eyes dull. They didn't heal. They removed. Pain, infection, doubt. One piece at a time. And always you paid. Not in coin if you had none, but with favors, with chickens, with silence. He never gave receipts. He never returned for thanks. He came when you bled, and he left when you stopped. Pain didn't end when the blade was gone. It lingered. It curled into your joints and slept beneath your ribs. The wound might scab, the bleeding might stop, but the ache became something else, a quiet companion. It followed you to work, to meals, to restless nights, and worse than the pain was the fear of its return. One cough, one swelling, one dark spot on the skin, and your mind already pictured the barber again, warming his iron, testing his saw, nodding silently as he approached. You stopped complaining. Everyone did. There were no recovery rooms, no clean beds. You lay where you fell, on straw, on wood, on damp earth. You pulled a blanket over the wound and hoped no one stepped on it during the night. You drank if you had something strong. You bit down when the fever came. You didn't cry out, because if you cried out, they'd come. And if they came, they might cut again. Barbers did more than amputate. They lanced boils, drained abscesses, cut away blackened flesh with the precision of a man sawing firewood. They also did bloodletting, not because it worked, but because they were told it might. People believed illness was in the blood. Too much blood, too close to the surface, and your humors were unbalanced. So they opened your veins with a small knife and let it spill into a bowl, onto the floor, into the dirt under your cot, until the dizziness calmed the fever, or until it didn't. No one questioned the method. They only questioned how much. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and you fell asleep and didn't wake up. The barber always watched, eyes narrowed, fingers pressed to your wrist. Sometimes he'd stop, sometimes he wouldn't. He wasn't cruel, just tired. There was always someone else waiting, another shoulder swollen with pus, another leg black from frost, another man trembling from something no one understood. When barbers weren't cutting, they were pulling. Splinters, arrows, teeth, worms. Yes, worms. Infected skin often bred strange things, white, wriggling. They said they came from bad spirits or spoiled bread or from curses. Whatever the cause, the barber would prod the skin with a heated rod and dig them out. No gloves, no questions. Just digging. You watched as the man beside you screamed into his fist. And when your turn came, you did the same. Children feared him. Adults feared him. Even animals backed away when he passed. Dogs whimpered. Cats vanished. His boots left streaks on the ground. Blood, ash, soot. He smelled of old wool and vinegar and something else no one could name. Maybe burnt meat. Maybe fear. When he entered a room, the air changed. Laughter died. Bowls were pushed aside. People stood without being asked. And yet, despite all that, you needed him. When your son couldn't move his arm, when your wife coughed blood, when your father hadn't spoken in 3 days and his eyes rolled like marbles. The barber came. He didn't promise healing. He didn't speak gently. He only opened his bag, spread his tools, and began. If you were lucky, someone survived. If not, he packed his blades and walked out before the body cooled. He didn't stay long. He couldn't. There was always another village, another fever, another limb that had turned the wrong color. He never ran out of work. Just daylight. Not every wound came from illness. Some came from labor. From a slip with the axe, from a misstep near the well, from a cartwheel that crushed instead of rolled. You screamed once, twice, and then the blood filled your boot. Someone ran to get him. Not the priest, not your brother, the barber. Because when flesh tore, when bones cracked, when your mouth opened wide and no words came out, only he could stop what had begun. He arrived slowly. He always did. No rush, no panic. He'd seen worse. He'd seen everything. A hand missing 3 fingers tied with a belt. A child with ribs showing through the skin. A man with a nail in his eye, blinking around it. He didn't ask how it happened. It didn't matter. Only the damage mattered. Only how deep it went. He opened his satchel like a priest opening scripture. The tools inside weren't wrapped or polished. They clinked against each other like teeth. A blade dull from last week's work. A hook meant for fish but used now for tendons. A pair of shears blackened at the hinge. He'd choose what felt right. There was no logic, only habit. You didn't ask why, you just lay still. Pain had already begun before he touched you. That was the secret. Your mind had already gone ahead, already pictured the worst. So when he pressed the hot iron to the wound, the shock was almost a relief. There was no scream left, just the smell. Burned cloth, burned skin, burned blood. He muttered again. Not a prayer, just a pattern. Words to keep his hands steady. Words to hold his mind in place. Sometimes you fought, flinched, begged. He didn't pause. He didn't scold. He pushed your arm down and kept going. Pain wasn't a reason to stop. Pain was proof you were alive. He worked quickly, wiping with the same rag, cutting where he must, burning when he had to. When you passed out, he didn't wait. He finished while your body slackened, tying what he could with twine or strips of your own tunic. He left behind silence, a pile of bloodied cloth, a wound no longer open, and breath, shallow but still moving. You might wake, you might not. That wasn't his burden. His work was the doing, not the waiting. In winter, his hands cracked from cold. In summer, they slicked with sweat and flies. He never looked clean. His nails were always dark. His sleeves stiff with what didn't wash out. He smelled of boiled leather and burnt marrow. But his touch, somehow, always found the broken parts. His fingers knew where the pain hid. He never smiled, never lingered, just left when it was over, taking his tools and his silence with him. People said he had no heart, that he drank to forget, that he talked to the dead. But no one asked him. No one dared. He'd seen too many open bellies, too many eyes cloud over mid-sentence. He knew how life left a body. He knew how fast it could vanish. So he stayed moving, from house to field, from barn to shack. He treated what no one else would touch. He cut when others ran. He stitched what others feared to look at. And when the blood dried, when the fever broke or the heart stopped, he didn't cry. He just wiped his blade and moved on. You didn't pay him in coin. Not always. Most times you had nothing to give. So you offered what you could. A basket of onions, a cracked bottle of vinegar, a promise of wood in winter. He never asked. He only nodded and moved on. Sometimes he came back months later, stood in your doorway silent until you remembered what you owed. And you paid. because he didn't forget. And because someday, someone else in your house would bleed. He never worked by light. Lamps were scarce, oil was dear. Most of his work happened by the dull glow of a hearth or a lantern flickering in the wind. Shadows danced on his hands. They made the tools look bigger, longer, more like weapons than instruments. And maybe that's what they were, not for healing, but for forcing the body to surrender its rot. A quiet war against what festered inside you. You didn't invite him, you endured him. He never knocked softly. He pounded with a fist, stepped in without waiting, and took the space like it belonged to him. No greetings, no how are yous. Just a nod toward the patient and the familiar sound of iron clicking open. Sometimes he didn't come alone. A boy followed him, thin, wide-eyed, carrying the smaller tools in a cloth roll. The boy never spoke. He only watched and flinched. You pitied him. You wondered how many screams he'd heard, how many times he'd held a lantern while someone died beneath it. You wondered when he'd stop flinching. When the barber spoke, it was with the tone of someone who knew they wouldn't be questioned. His voice was flat, almost bored. Instructions, not conversation. Hold the leg. Bite down. Don't move. He didn't care if you cried. He didn't care if you begged. He only cared that you stayed still long enough to finish. His shop, if you could call it that, wasn't a place people entered willingly. It was a single room, dirt floor, a bench stained dark, hooks on the wall for tools, no windows, no signs, just the smell, thick, heavy, unshakable, a stew of sweat, old blood, burnt wool, and sickness. You only went there when the pain had become too much to carry home. The floor was always damp, the air sour. There was no fire unless he needed to heat the iron. He saved fuel. He saved everything. Rags washed until they tore. Thread used twice. Bones sometimes kept for reasons you didn't want to know. His chair, low, wide, slanted, wasn't for comfort. It was built for collapse. So when you slumped forward, you didn't fall far. Some swore he was cursed, that no man could see what he saw and remain whole, that something had crawled inside him long ago when he first sliced open a living man and watched what spilled out. But curses didn't stop the bleeding. He did, and so he was called, again and again. You didn't thank him. Gratitude felt strange around him. You only watched him pack his things, wipe his hands on his apron, and vanish through the door before the blood stopped steaming. There were no apprenticeships in the way you might imagine. No written tests, no certificates, no applause when a boy became a man under the weight of a scalpel. The barber taught by doing, by pointing, by nodding when it was your turn to press the cloth to the wound. You learned quickly, or the patient didn't survive. And that failure didn't end with silence. It ended with a stare, a heavy pause, and the sense that something inside you had broken beyond repair. Blood had a sound. You learned that early. The hiss when it met the fire-heated blade, the splash when it hit cold stone, the gurgle when a lung collapsed. These were lessons. They weren't taught, only heard. And you remembered them. You remembered every sound that came from inside a human body when it was forced open. You didn't dream anymore. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and thick. You lay on straw that scratched and bit, and when you closed your eyes, the screams echoed still. Sometimes you woke with the smell of iron in your nose. Sometimes you didn't sleep at all. But the barber rose before dawn no matter what, and if you followed him, you kept pace or you were left behind. He didn't explain things. He'd just hand you a tool, gesture toward a wound, and wait. And if you hesitated, the look he gave you wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was disappointed. Like he'd misjudged you. Like he already saw your future ending in failure, and you'd force your hand to move, not because you were ready, but because you couldn't stand that gaze a second longer. People didn't want to see you in the street. They crossed to the other side. They avoided your eyes. Even if you'd saved someone, even if your stitch had held, and the fever had broken, you weren't remembered for success. You were remembered for being part of the blood. You were associated with suffering, and no one wanted to speak with suffering unless they had to. There was no pride, no joy. The best days were the ones with fewer cries. The worst were the ones where the air never stopped shaking. Winter brought frostbite, infections that blackened limbs. Spring brought births, many of them bloody and tragic. Summer brought flies and rot. Autumn, old wounds reopening with the damp. The barber never changed his pace. The seasons moved, people aged, children died, but he moved the same way. Steady, deliberate, like he'd made peace with the horror, or at least found a place inside it where he could breathe. You tried to copy that, but your hands still trembled sometimes. And he noticed. He always noticed. There were times he left you alone with the patient, as if to test you, as if to see whether you'd run, and part of you wanted to, but your feet wouldn't move. You remembered the boy from the last village, the one who hadn't tied the tourniquet tight enough, who now followed the carts instead, hoping to collect what was left behind. So you stayed. You cleaned. You stitched. You pressed the hot iron to skin and didn't flinch when the smell filled your mouth. You didn't cry when the mother begged you to save her son. You didn't look away when he stopped breathing. You just wiped your hands and waited for the barber to return. Sometimes he didn't return. Sometimes he left before dawn, taking the satchel, the flask, and nothing else. You'd wake and find the space where he slept cold, the air oddly still, the quiet somehow heavier than usual. There was no note. He didn't believe in writing things down. If he thought you were ready, he didn't say it. He just vanished and left the chair, the blades, and the blood to you. You waited that first day, cleaned the floor, sorted the tools. But by dusk, someone knocked. They were holding a child wrapped in cloth, red leaking through the fabric. You didn't feel ready. But you opened the door, you pointed to the chair, and the mother obeyed. Your hands shook. You hated that. You wrapped the cloth tight. You found the right blade. You pressed it, and the skin parted too easily. The child screamed. The mother wept. You worked. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But it was done. You didn't look at their faces when they left. You just sat on the bench and waited for the trembling to stop. By the second day, there were more knocks. An old man with a swollen leg, a girl with a burn. You did what you could. You reused thread. You reheated water. You listened for breath, felt for pulse. You prayed, but only once. The rest of the time, you moved. They started calling you barber, not boy, not helper. Just the word he'd carried for years. You weren't sure how to feel. It wasn't praise. It wasn't even respect. It was need. People needed someone who could hold a blade without crying, who could bind a wound and not run when the pus spilled out. Some thanked you, quietly, awkwardly. Most didn't. They left coins or eggs or rags by the door. You didn't ask for more. You couldn't. Asking meant admitting you were still unsure, still unready, so you nodded and kept working. The tools grew heavier with each use. You sharpened them by firelight. Your hands bore tiny scars, reminders of slips, of haste. You started wrapping your fingers in cloth, not to protect them, but to hide the shaking. Some nights it worked. Then he came back. No knock, no sound, just the door creaking open and his shadow filling the room. You looked up and couldn't speak. He didn't smile. He just scanned the table, the blades, the half-clean cloths soaking in vinegar. He picked up a tool, turned it in his hand, put it down. He didn't speak for a long time. You stood, waited. Then, one word. Continue. And he sat in the corner, watching, not judging, just there, breathing the same thick air, letting you move. That night you treated a man with a split scalp. He moaned through clenched teeth. You stitched slowly, evenly, and when it was done you turned to him. He nodded once. That was the only praise he ever gave. But it was enough. He never told stories, but you learned to read him like a book left out in the rain. Worn, waterlogged, and missing pages, he had a limp that worsened in the cold. He rubbed his wrist when he worked too long. There was a scar on his neck, jagged and gray, hidden under the collar of his coat. You never asked how he got it. You knew better. The past in men like him wasn't told. It was carried. He never drank while he worked, only after. The same flask, the same 3 sips, the same quiet stare into the coals. You didn't speak during those moments. You sat across from him, pretending to mend rags or clean the bone saw. But you watched. You always watched. He'd blink slowly, like each thought was a weight dragging him deeper. He looked not at the fire, but through it, as if searching for something in the flicker, something he hadn't found yet, or something he had and lost. At times he'd test you, not with words but with silence. He'd hand you a case, a wound that went too deep, a fever that wouldn't break. He'd stand back, arms crossed, and let you fail. Not cruelly, not carelessly. He just knew the truth. Failure was the teacher. Success was a brief pause between mistakes. You came to understand that. He kept a box under his cot, locked. You'd seen him open it twice. Once to remove a bundle wrapped in wax cloth, which he tucked into his coat before leaving for a berth. Another time, he placed something inside. A book, maybe, or bones. You never knew. You never asked. One day you might open it, but not yet. Not while he was still breathing. His rules were few, but unbreakable. Never waste a sharp edge. Never cut without a second clean cloth. Never show fear when they scream. And never, ever lie about the outcome. If they were dying, they needed to know. It was the only mercy you were allowed to give. He told you that once, the only time he ever spoke of kindness. It wasn't a speech, just a mutter, spoken while tying off a tourniquet. Truth, he said, hurts less than hope. Then he went quiet for the rest of the night. You remembered that. You carried it into every room, every wound. You didn't say, "You'll be fine." You said, "Hold still." You didn't promise. You delivered, or you didn't. But you never lied. He taught you how to feel for a pulse when the skin was cold, how to sniff a wound and know if the rot had gone to the bone, how to pull a tooth without snapping the jaw, how to tell when someone was pretending to be brave, how to tell when they were already gone. Sometimes he'd watch you sleep, not in malice, not in care, just watching, as if to see whether your hands twitched, whether your face showed what your mouth would never admit. He was waiting for something, maybe for you to break, maybe for you to stop, but you didn't. And so he stayed. Until the next knock came. The knock was softer than usual, not urgent, not panicked, just steady, as though the visitor had knocked many doors before this one. You opened it, expecting the usual, a swollen leg, a broken tooth, another night spent in blood and breath. But what stood before you was different. It was a boy, no older than 12, thin, barefoot, his eyes too wide, his voice barely audible. He didn't carry a basket. He didn't explain. He just looked past you into the dim room behind and said the word that always made the air shift. "Please." You let him in. The barber hadn't spoken yet. He never did during the first moments. He just stepped aside, letting silence stretch like skin before a blade. The boy led you to his father, waiting in the alley behind the butcher's stall. He couldn't walk, could barely lift his head. The stench told the story first. Weeks of infection, a festering wound along his side, blackened skin weeping yellow. He was burning up. The barber knelt, pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat, then his wrist, then nodded once. Not a good nod, just a confirmation. The kind that said, yes, this one is dying. There was no debate, no time. The stretcher was brought. He was carried inside, wrapped in cloth too thin for warmth. You prepared the tools. He heated the blade. The boy waited near the door, hands shaking, face stone still. You recognized that look. The look of someone who knew what pain was, even if they hadn't felt it themselves. The man didn't resist. Fever had dulled his nerves. He mumbled things that made no sense. Names, directions, prayers. The barber worked quickly. He always did with cases like this. When hope was low and death too close, he moved like a man chasing light down a tunnel. The wound was cut. The pus spilled. You held the cloth as it soaked through. You didn't gag anymore. You hadn't in weeks. The smell was part of you now. It followed you even when the room was empty. The barber packed the wound with moss, soaked in vinegar and crushed herbs. A guess, a ritual, a hope carved into habit. Then he stitched, not tightly, just enough to hold the flesh. He looked at you once and said the word he rarely used. Watch. So you did. You watched the man breathe, chest rising in short bursts. You watched his lips crack as he whispered a name. Not the boy's, someone else. Maybe someone already gone. You didn't ask. By morning he was still alive. Not better, but breathing. The boy sat beside him, dozing with his head against the wall. The barber stood by the coals, warming his hands. He didn't look tired. He never did. But something in his shoulders seemed heavier than usual. You offered him bread. He didn't take it. Won't last, he said. Just that. And he was right. The man died before noon. No cries, no gasps, just stillness. The boy didn't scream. He didn't speak. He just watched as you closed his father's eyes, folded the cloth over the face, and stepped away. You opened the door, pointed to the field where others were buried. The boy left without a word. You didn't stop him. That night, neither of you spoke. The barber sharpened a knife. You boiled the cloths. The house smelled of vinegar and smoke. Another knock would come. It always did. You didn't sleep that night. Not fully. The kind of rest you got was the kind where your body stopped moving, but your thoughts didn't. The room stayed dark, though the coals never fully died. The barber sat in his usual place, still, motionless. His shadow wavered with the heat from the hearth, but he didn't. You knew he was awake. You didn't ask. There was no discussion of the boy, no mention of the body you helped carry to the edge of the field. The grave was shallow. The ground was frozen near the roots. Your hands blistered from the digging. He hadn't helped. He just stood beside you with the shovel across his shoulder, watching the road, as if expecting someone else to arrive. The boy never returned. You didn't ask where he went. No one did. His father's body had joined the others, nameless, faceless, quiet beneath the frost. The only proof he had lived at all was the rag you'd used to wipe his brow, now stiff with blood and sweat, tossed in a bin you hadn't emptied yet. Work returned quickly. It always did. That was the rule. Grief waits, but fever does not. Before the sun had risen fully, a girl knocked, swollen jaw, fever in the eyes. An hour later, a man with a splintered foot from a cartwheel. Then a birth gone wrong. Then a boil under the arm that stank of rot. You moved between cases like furniture being rearranged. Quietly, without resistance. You said little. He said less. You stitched without flinching. You cleaned your hands with vinegar and cloth, scrubbed them raw until they stung, then started again. The pain helped. It brought you back when your mind wandered to the boy's face, still blank as you placed the shovel in his hand. The barber didn't praise you, but he watched longer now. Stood behind you more often. His silence had shifted. Less caution, more weight. As if you'd passed a test neither of you had spoken aloud. He let you choose the tools, let you clean the wounds without direction. He only stepped in when the bleeding ran too fast or the patient thrashed too wildly. There was another man who came to die that week. He didn't know it when he walked in, but the barber did. You saw it in the way he stepped back slightly, the way his hands dropped to his sides before the man even spoke. You handled that case alone. He didn't stop you, just sat and watched until the breath slowed, until the skin dulled. Later that night, he finally spoke. You buried him wrong. You looked up. The fire was low, the coals dull red. What? The man, the boy's father. You left the feet pointed uphill. You blinked, didn't know whether to answer. He'll never rest. You swallowed. The room was cold now, despite the fire. I didn't know. I did, he said, and nothing more. He stood, poured water into the basin, and began washing his hands. The same ritual, slow and methodical. You watched the blood spiral into the water, faint, thin, pink like memory fading. You didn't speak again that night. But when morning came, you found him outside, facing the path, a shovel in his hand. Not yours. His. He was already walking toward the field. You followed him without asking. The frost cracked beneath your boots, brittle like thin bone. He didn't look back, just walked, shovel over his shoulder, coat buttoned tight, breath rising in steady, pale clouds. The path was narrow, lined with bare branches that scratched at your sleeves as you passed. Crows followed above, silent but watching. The grave wasn't hard to find. You remembered the spot, just left of the crooked stone, under the shadow of a leaning tree. The earth had settled overnight, leaving a shallow depression like an old bruise. He stood over it for a while, saying nothing. Then he knelt. You didn't expect him to dig. You thought he might mark it, whisper something, and leave. But he pressed the blade into the ground and began to work. Slow, careful. You hesitated, then stepped beside him, took the second shovel and joined. Neither of you spoke. The ground resisted, roots tangled the soil, frozen mud clung to the steel. Your arms ached quickly. His did not. He worked like someone used to undoing mistakes. You kept pace. You had to. The silence stretched between you, filled only by the scrape of iron and the shifting of dirt. When the body appeared, you both paused. The cloth was damp now, darker than before. No insects, no smell, just weight. He reached down and turned the corpse, adjusting the angle. Feet downhill, arms folded properly, head repositioned. That's how it should be, he said. You nodded. He stepped back. You refilled the grave. No prayer, no gesture, just dirt returning to dirt. On the way back, he didn't speak. But his pace was slower, not weak, measured, as though something had settled in him. Something old, something long carried. You didn't press. You walked beside him until the shop came into view, smoke still curling from the chimney, a rooster crowing in the distance like nothing had changed. The day began again. Another knock, a twisted ankle, then a rash spreading across a baby's belly. You lit the fire. He boiled the water. The blood returned to your hands. Familiar, warm, routine. That night, as you laid out the tools, he watched you. "You're not like the others," he said. You didn't answer. You weren't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. "They all leave," he added. "Why?" He rubbed his wrists as if something inside them ached beyond bone. "They think it's about fixing people." You waited. "But it's not," he said. "It's about standing still when everyone else runs." You nodded slowly. "And cutting," he said finally. "Always cutting." You looked at the blade in your hand, clean now, sharp again. You'd used it 3 times today. You'd use it again tomorrow. You weren't sure how you felt about that. But your fingers didn't shake anymore. Your stomach didn't turn. You placed the blade back on the cloth. He didn't need to say more. You understood. There was a rhythm to the days now. You woke before light, washed your face with water that bit your skin, dressed in the same stiff apron still stained from the week before. The fire was always low, never quite out, like it knew its place. You stirred the coals, added peat or wood if you had it, and waited for the knock. The barber no longer hovered. He watched, yes, but from a distance. You handled the first visitors alone, a woman with a twisted wrist, an old man with a cough that rattled his ribs. You packed herbs, drained pus, stitched a tear in a boy's leg from a fall in the woods. Your hands moved without needing direction. That frightened you more than you expected. You still flinched at certain things. A cracked fingernail peeled back to the quick, a child too quiet during the stitching. But you didn't stop. You learned to work through the tremble, to nod gently when the mother cried, to press your hand firm against the bleeding until the worst of it passed. That evening, after the last visitor left with a bandaged eye and a jar of boiled sage, the barber sat across from you. His eyes were red. Not from tears, he didn't have any left, but from smoke, age, and long nights staring at things most people never saw. "You'll need to go soon," he said. You didn't look up. You were washing your tools. One had bent slightly after digging too deep. You pressed it against the stone, adjusted it back with careful fingers. "There's a village east of the ridge," he continued. "No one there knows what they're doing." You waited. "They asked for someone, not me, but someone." The cloth in your hand soaked red from a cut you hadn't noticed on your palm. You didn't flinch, just folded it tighter. "I thought I was staying here," you said. He leaned back. The chair creaked. The shadows deepened. "You were," he said, "but you're ready now." You weren't, but you didn't say that. "You're not sending me," you said slowly. "You're letting me go." His mouth twitched. Not a smile, just movement. Then nothing. That night you didn't sleep. You packed quietly. Not much to carry. A small roll of tools, cloth, vinegar, twine. You left the apron hanging. It wasn't yours, not really. He rose before you, already stoking the fire, already boiling water for the next wound. He didn't stop to say goodbye. You didn't ask him to. But at the door he handed you something wrapped in black oilcloth. Heavy, flat. You opened it later by the edge of the woods. A knife, bone-handled, sharpened to a fine edge. The blade bore a mark. Not his name, not yours. Just a symbol, scratched deep and hard, like it had resisted being made. You carried it for years after. It wasn't about the blade. It was about the hand that passed it to you. The village was smaller than you expected. just a line of crooked homes slouching into the hillside, roofs patched with moss and old cloth, smoke curling thin from broken chimneys. No sign marked your arrival. No one met you at the edge of the path. You walked in quiet, your boots heavy with frozen mud, the bag of tools tugging your shoulder with every step. You found a place, not clean, not warm, but empty. An abandoned smithy with a cold forge and rotted shelves. You swept the floor with your sleeve, built a fire with wet twigs, and unpacked the cloths. You didn't hang a sign. You didn't call out. You just lit the fire and waited. They came slowly. A boy first, nose bleeding and teeth loose from a fall. Then a man with a splinter gone septic, his arm already twice its proper size. A woman, shaking from fever, her eyes darting like she'd seen death behind you. You said little. You let them speak first. Some called you surgeon, others healer. One old man called you butcher, and meant it kindly. They didn't ask where you came from. No one did. They only asked if you could help. And you tried. Your fingers remembered what to do. Boil, cut, stitch, wrap. You moved without needing to think, and that scared you sometimes. You didn't want the pain to feel normal. But it did. And they kept coming. At night, you sat alone, back to the stone wall, your knife beside you, blade clean and shining. You didn't eat much, didn't sleep deeply. You dreamed of the shop, of the fire, of the man who had taught you everything without ever raising his voice. You hadn't said goodbye, not properly. You wondered if he minded, but in your gut, you knew. He preferred it that way. On the 6th night, someone knocked. A girl no older than 10. Her face pale, hands raw, eyes too still. She didn't speak, just pointed behind her. You followed. Her brother lay on a board, breathing in short, wet gasps. Blood from the mouth. A wound in the side, stitched with something that wasn't thread. His skin was gray. You knelt, listened, knew. Too far gone. You told her gently. She didn't cry. She just nodded and sat beside him, holding his hand with fingers that trembled. You stayed until the breathing stopped. Then you helped her close his eyes. You offered to bury him. She shook her head. I'll do it, she said. And you let her. The next morning she returned, not with questions, with a bundle of cloth, old, fraying. Inside, herbs, roots, bark, a gift. From my mother, she said. You thanked her. You didn't smile. Later you sat beside the fire, sharpening the blade. The symbol on the bone handle caught the light, just for a second. You pressed your thumb to it, felt the rough edges. You remembered his hands, thick, scarred, steady. You didn't know if he was still alive, but his work was. And now it was yours. You didn't count the days. The sun rose, the wounds came, the blood dried, and the fire dimmed. Then it began again. The village grew used to you. They didn't speak your name, perhaps they never learned it. But they nodded when you passed, moved aside when you carried your basin to the well, left bread or eggs near your door. No thanks, just offerings, like to a shrine that asked only for silence in return. You repaired the roof of the smithy with strips of leather and hay, packed the walls with moss, kept the coals burning even when there were no visitors. The place smelled always of ash, vinegar, and faint rot. You didn't mind. The scent was honest. It matched your hands. Children stared at you, wide-eyed and wordless. They'd heard screams behind your door. They'd seen men limp in and crawl out. Some of them came too, when fever took hold or a fall cracked a bone. You didn't soften your voice. You didn't promise ease. You showed them the blade. You let them decide whether they'd stay. Most did. One afternoon, a storm came, hard and sudden. Wind sharp enough to rip bark from trees. A boy arrived, soaked to the bone, his foot trailing blood. You let him in, set him near the fire, peeled the boot away. The skin beneath was torn open, raw as butcher's meat. "A trap," he said. His uncle had said it. He hadn't seen it in time. You boiled water. He didn't ask for anything. Just lay there, blinking slowly, breathing like each inhale was a weight. You cleaned the wound, removed the shrapnel, bits of iron, splinters of wood. He cried, but not loudly. You packed it with moss, wrapped it tight, and told him to return tomorrow. He nodded once. When he left, the room stayed full, as if the pain had made a shape and it hadn't yet found the door. That night, you dreamed of the old shop, the fire brighter than it had ever been, the chair empty, the walls bare, the barber standing by the window, his back to you. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. You felt the weight of his silence, and when you woke, your mouth was full of smoke that wasn't real. By spring, your fingers had hardened. The nicks no longer bled. The thread passed through skin like cloth now. You knew how far to cut, when to stop. You knew when to say, "Too late," and when to say, "Not yet." Someone once asked if you were a doctor. You said no. Doctors wore clean coats and read Latin. You wore the same apron every day and spoke in commands. Still, they trusted you. Because when a woman's leg turned black, you didn't blink. When a man's throat swelled until he couldn't speak, you opened it with a knife and drained the infection with a reed. When a child fell from a tree and broke his arm in 3 places, you said it without a wince. They trusted you because you didn't fear the blood. But the truth was simpler. You feared nothing, because fear had long since been cut from you. There was a woman who came to you in early summer. She wasn't old, but her eyes had the weight of someone who'd carried pain for decades. She didn't speak at first, just placed a cloth bundle on the table and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a hand, not severed, still attached to her wrist, but twisted, purple, and stiff. 2 fingers had curled inward, skin stretched tight, joints swollen to twice their size. You knew the look. Infection beneath the nail bed, maybe deeper. You pressed lightly and felt the heat bloom under your fingertips. She didn't flinch. She only said, 3 days ago, started with a scratch. You nodded. She already knew what had to be done. You didn't ask her to wait. You didn't explain. You lit the fire, cleaned the tools, boiled the water. She rolled up her sleeve, sat down, and braced herself. Her face was still, but her breathing changed. Slow, forced, shallow. You worked fast. Not rushed, but without pause. The nail lifted easily, too easily. The flesh beneath was already black. You cleaned, scraped, and pressed. Blood ran thin, nearly brown. Not good. You looked at her. The fingers need to go. She nodded once. You didn't delay. You tied the cloth tight above the wrist. You let her bite down on her own scarf. And when the blade came down, there was no scream, just the soft grunt of someone who had already lived through worse. The sound of bone was dull, the sound of her breath, steady. You cauterized the ends, wrapped the hand in clean cloth. She didn't thank you, just stood slowly, left a single coin on the table, and walked out into the dust. You watched her go. Later, you unwrapped the cloth again, cleaned the blood, sharpened the blade. The fingers you'd removed sat beside the basin, pale and slightly curled, like they hadn't noticed they were gone. You buried them behind the forge, near the stone you'd started using to mark such things. By now, it was a small line of mounds. You didn't remember each name. You only remembered what was lost. A toe from the girl with frostbite. A man's ear, torn during a fight. a breast, removed when the skin turned hard and gray. The body was never whole when it left your hands, and yet they still came, because what you left behind didn't matter as much as what you saved. You began keeping a list, not of names, most didn't give them, but of injuries. A crude ledger in charcoal on the inside of your door, dates, descriptions, results. Sometimes just a line that read, "Survived." Other times a darker mark, no words. You told yourself it was for memory, but deep down, you knew it was for something else. Proof. Proof that you had done something, that you hadn't simply cut and burned and bled in vain, that some part of this, of all of this, still mattered. You didn't look at the list often, but you never erased it. The list grew slowly, but steadily. Each mark, each line etched in dull strokes, became its own kind of grave. You didn't decorate it, didn't frame it, just added to it in silence after the last wound of the day had been wrapped and the last scream faded into the earth. No one else ever saw it. The door closed each morning, and the names, or lack of them, waited in the dark. Some days you didn't add anything. Those days felt strange, unfinished, as though the air itself had paused to breathe. But they never lasted. Blood always found its way back to your doorstep. It didn't need an invitation. One evening a man came who looked too clean for the village. His boots were whole, his coat patched neatly, his beard trimmed like someone still cared how he looked. He smelled of travel, dust, wax, the faint musk of horses. He didn't speak at first, just stared at your hands. "You trained with the old one," he said eventually. You didn't answer. He stepped closer. "He taught me too, long ago, before he left." You still didn't speak, but your hands curled slightly over the basin. The man smiled, not kindly, just knowingly. "He didn't mention me, did he?" "No," you said. He chuckled. "That sounds like him." You noticed the way he stood, not like a patient, like someone measuring a room, taking stock, judging what could be taken, what could be used. "I heard he was dead," he added. You said nothing. "I came to see if what he passed on was worth anything." He stepped toward the door, ran a finger along the edge of your ledger, looked at the marks. "Keeping score?" he asked. You didn't respond. He glanced at your blade, the one with the bone handle, the scratched symbol. "Still using that?" he asked. "Yes." He sniffed. "He gave me one too. Didn't keep it." You waited. He turned, started to leave. "You're doing it wrong, you know. All of it." You followed him to the door, watched him step into the fading light. He paused on the threshold. "He used to say you can't save everyone." You nodded. "He was wrong," the man said. "You can. You just have to stop caring what it costs." Then he was gone. You didn't move for a while. The coals hissed behind you. The wind touched the back of your neck. Later, you marked another line on the door. Not for a wound, not for a death. Just a moment. A reminder. Some lessons came from silence. Others from what silence left behind. You sharpened your blade that night longer than usual. Not because it was dull, but because your hands needed to feel something that wasn't slipping away. Summer passed without notice. You knew only by the smell. Rot turning sweet in the heat. The sweat of patients soaking through linen before they reached the door. The work didn't lessen. Fevers bloomed like weeds. Wounds took longer to close. The blood came thinner, more sluggish. Flies swarmed more eagerly, and you burned sage near the window just to keep the buzzing out of your skull. The list on the door grew 3 more lines. 1 survived. 2 didn't. You spoke less now, only what was necessary. "Sit," Hold still. Bite down. The rest was silence, the kind that lived in the corners of rooms and settled in the folds of your apron. Even your thoughts had begun to move slower, like thick sap sliding down the trunk of something old and hollowed. Then came the child with the broken ribs. He arrived in the arms of a stranger, wrapped in a wool blanket, half-conscious, mouth flecked with dry blood. A fall from a tree, they said, but the bruises didn't match. You knew what caused breaks like that. Fists, boots, fear. You took him in anyway. The barber would have done the same. You placed him on the table, felt along his ribs, heard the rattle in his chest when he tried to breathe. One side was caved in slightly, the skin hot, the bones too soft. You pressed gently and felt movement beneath, not healing but collapse. You bound him carefully, not too tight, just enough to hold him together. He stayed the night, slept little, cried once. In the morning he looked at you, eyes too old for a child's face. Will it stop hurting? You didn't lie. No. He nodded like he already knew. The man who brought him never returned. You gave the boy a place near the fire, fed him broth when you had it, taught him how to clean the basin, how to sort the tools. You didn't speak of the pain. He didn't ask. At night he traced the lines on the door with his finger. Not reading, just touching, feeling the texture of what suffering left behind. You thought about the barber more often now, not the man himself, but the gaps around him. All the things he never said, never taught directly. He'd known you'd learn through the doing, through the losing, through the ache. And now you understood what he meant by not everyone breaks clean. You didn't know how long the boy would stay. You didn't ask his name. Names were fragile. They cracked when you held them too tightly. Instead, you gave him tasks. Let him carry water. Let him feel the weight of the shears. Let him sit in silence while someone moaned in the other room. The first time he saw you open a wound, he didn't look away. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did you, but you left the fire burning low just in case. He stirred near dawn, curled tight beneath your coat. His ribs still clicked when he moved, but he didn't complain. You watched him breathe, not evenly, but still breathing. The boy didn't ask to learn. He simply began. Quiet at first, fetching water, cleaning blades, boiling cloth. He watched how you pressed fingers to throats, how you listened with your ear against chests, how you adjusted the tightness of a wrap, not by sight but by instinct. He mimicked without comment, sometimes too well. You caught him once standing over a sleeping man, eyes tracing a wound, hand twitching as if to reach for the knife. You took it from him that night. No lecture, just placed the blade on the highest shelf and nodded toward the cot. He understood. But the next morning it was he who lit the fire. He who boiled the vinegar and laid out the tools before the first knock came. The work continued. A farmer's hand crushed in a press. A girl whose foot had rotted black from frost the winter before. An old man coughing blood into a kerchief already stained from last week's bleeding. You tended them all with the boy at your side, never flinching now, his silence beginning to echo your own. You noticed the way he stood, close enough to see, far enough to flee, his fingers curled at his sides when pain filled the room. His mouth tightened when mothers wept. But he didn't run. That was more than most could manage. You'd seen strong men turn pale at their own wounds. You'd seen fathers crumble when their sons stopped breathing. But this boy, broken as he was, held fast. Some nights he cried, not loudly, not where you could see, but you heard it. Curled against the wall, face hidden in the folds of an old coat, shoulders trembling. You didn't stop him. Let the grief drain. better to bleed now than later. You remembered what it had felt like, that first year, the weight of it all pressing into your lungs, the sound of someone dying just outside your dreams, the way your hands wouldn't stop shaking until they finally did, and then, never again. You left the knife lower now, within reach. You didn't hand it to him. You just made it easier to find. And he noticed. One evening a woman came in screaming, her arm wrapped tight, blood soaking through, a bite. Animal or man, she didn't say. Skin split open, already shining with heat and infection. She collapsed in the doorway. You dragged her to the table. You didn't ask the boy to help. He stepped in without cue, holding the arm as you cleaned it, speaking low, repeating your words as if they were prayer. Hold still, breathe, don't look. When you sewed the wound shut, he watched every stitch. When she left, still breathing, you found him washing the blood from the floor, slowly, carefully, until the stone gleamed. He didn't look up when he spoke. She won't die. You said nothing. He turned to you, eyes hollow but sure. I want to stay. You nodded, not because he was ready, but because now you both understood what that meant. The rains came late that year. When they did, they came hard, flattening crops, seeping through every crack in every roof, turning roads into rivers and yards into pits of sucking mud. People arrived soaked, coughing, fevered. You worked by lamplight most evenings, the boy holding the flame steady, his face pale but steady. The forge roof gave way first, a slow leak at first, then a drop, then a steady line of water that traced the wall and pooled under the table. You moved the cot, shifted your supplies to higher shelves. Mold crept in overnight, curling at the corners of your ledger. The list remained legible, though some names blurred. You didn't rewrite them. If they vanished, they vanished. The boy didn't complain. He caught water in buckets, swept mud from the stones, kept the fire lit even when the smoke made his eyes swell red. You heard him coughing in his sleep, but each morning he rose without a word. That week, the woman with the bitten arm returned. She brought her son. His skin was yellow, breath shallow, eyes drifting toward the ceiling even when you called his name. The boy helped you hold him down as you drained the swelling under his ribs. The pus was thick, foul, and hot. The smell filled the room and stayed long after she carried the child home wrapped in your only clean cloth. Later, the boy scrubbed the table harder than needed. He didn't speak, but his jaw stayed clenched until the wood gleamed. You knew he wouldn't live, he said. You didn't answer. You treated him anyway. You nodded. His shoulders sagged. I didn't want to be angry, he said. But I am. You let that hang between you, rain tapping against the wall like fingers searching for warmth. It's normal, you said. He exhaled slowly. How long does it last? You looked at your hands, the creases filled with dirt and dried blood. It changes shape, you said. But it never leaves. He nodded once. That night he added his first mark to the door. It was small, uneven, but deliberate. The next morning you woke to find him already tending to a woman's sprained ankle. He had her leg propped, wrapped in wool, fingers moving with care. You watched from the shadows of the room, unseen. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. When the woman left, he turned, saw you watching, and didn't look away. You said nothing. But that evening you gave him the smaller satchel, the one the barber had handed you years ago, still oiled, the straps soft from wear. Inside, thread, a folded cloth, and a single curved blade. Not sharp, not yet, but real. He held it like it might vanish. You'll sharpen it yourself, you said. He nodded, and for the first time since he'd arrived, You saw the faintest shift in his face. Not a smile, not relief. Something quieter. The understanding that comes when pain is no longer something that happens to you, but something you choose to face. The satchel never left his side after that. He slept with it near his head, checked its contents each morning, ran his fingers along the stitching as if memorizing every fold. You didn't ask what he was thinking. You knew. The first time you were handed a blade, you didn't sleep for 2 nights. Not from fear, from weight, responsibility, not iron. He began sharpening it in the evenings, not rushed, not carelessly. Small, deliberate strokes against the stone, his eyes fixed on the edge, his breath slow. You watched from across the room, arms folded, saying nothing. Soon you let him clean minor wounds himself. Split knuckles, blisters, insect bites turned raw. He washed them, dried them, pressed cloth to them. The first stitch he made was crooked. The second held. He said nothing after either. But you caught him tracing the thread after the patient left, pressing it flat with one finger again and again. The rains finally stopped. The roads hardened. The air turned thick with the smell of rot and wet earth. The village shifted too. Quiet at first, then more open. Doors left ajar, faces less drawn. Children outside again, chasing each other barefoot, though not far from home. And yet the knocks still came. They always did. One morning a man arrived carried by 2 others. Unconscious, wrapped in wool, damp with sweat. His lips cracked. His body shaking under the weight of a fever that pulsed from his skin in waves. You laid him on the table, pulled back the layers. His stomach was swollen. His side, black, glossy, split slightly at the seam of an old scar. Burst abscess. Deep, maybe deeper. You looked at the boy. He nodded. You opened the kit together, chose the blades, the cloth, the vinegar. The water boiled. The air thickened. The man groaned once, low, nearly soundless, as you cleaned the wound, sliced it wide enough to let the infection pour. The boy held the basin. The pus hit the bottom with a sound you both recognized now. You didn't gag. He didn't blink. He held the basin steady, even as the smell filled his nose, even as sweat slid down his temple. You finished the cleaning, packed the wound, stitched the edges. 3 tight pulls, then another 2. The bleeding slowed. The man's breathing deepened. You stepped back. "He'll wake," you said. The boy wiped his hands, nodded. But he stayed beside the man that night. Didn't sleep. Watched him breathe. Counted each rise and fall. By morning the man opened his eyes. Didn't speak. Just looked at the boy. And nodded once. That evening the boy made another mark on the door. Smaller than the last. But straighter. More confident. You didn't say anything. Just handed him the ledger. He didn't ask what to write. He already knew. The ledger stayed open now. Not always, not for everyone to see, but often enough that the boy no longer flinched at its presence. He added to it with charcoal from the hearth, the stub worn down between his fingers, the lines slow and deliberate. His script was clumsy, uneven, but it held weight. Each stroke made something permanent. Not a name always, just a wound, a date, a quiet note. Survived. Didn't. Stitched clean. Returned walking. You watched how he paused before each mark. He didn't ask what to write. He waited until his hands were steady, until the memory of what had just passed settled into something he could shape. The silence after a death no longer scared him. It slowed him, focused him, gave him time to see clearly. One morning, a child arrived, carried by her sister, fevered, limp. You laid her down, fingers already moving to feel the pulse. It was there, faint, fluttering. Her skin was hot, her breathing shallow. The sister's hands trembled as she held the child's leg, swollen and stiff at the knee. The boy stepped forward. "I can do this," he said. You didn't question him. You stepped back. He worked methodically, unwrapped the leg, cut the cloth where it stuck, cleaned around the wound with boiled water and vinegar. His face was blank, but his eyes moved constantly, checking, rechecking. When he pressed gently, the girl cried out. He didn't flinch. "She's still in there," he said softly, mostly to himself. He opened the abscess carefully. The smell filled the room, thick and sour. The pus ran slow, pale, streaked with red. He packed it with moss, stitched only the outer edge, just enough to keep it breathing. "She'll need watching," he said. You nodded. They stayed in the back room for 3 nights. He changed the dressing twice a day, sat beside her when the fever spiked, fanned her with a folded rag when the sweating soaked the bedding. The sister helped where she could, but it was the boy who kept the rhythm. By the 4th morning, the girl sat up, said nothing, just drank what he offered. The sister wept. The boy didn't smile. He just stood, washed the cloth, folded it, and went outside to gather more moss. That night he marked the ledger again. Just one word. Mended. You didn't need to see more. There was something else that changed after that. The villagers stopped knocking as often. Not because the pain had ended, it never did, but because they'd begun tending to each other more. They wrapped each other's hands. They boiled their own water. They asked the boy questions when you weren't there. And he answered. You didn't mind. He still returned to the fire each night, cleaned the tools, laid out the cloth for the next day. But now, when he looked at you, it wasn't with question. It wasn't even with need. It was with knowing. A weight shared, a quiet pact, something wordless between one who had bled and one who had learned to stop the bleeding. Autumn came soft that year, not with wind, but with a quiet chill that sank into the wood and made the walls of the forge creak at night. The boy began waking earlier, before the sun, before the first knock. You'd find him already by the fire, boiling water, folding cloth, sharpening blades without being asked. His hands moved with the calm of someone who no longer feared mistakes. Not because they never came, but because he knew how to carry them. He asked fewer questions. Not because he had all the answers. Just because now, when something went wrong, he stayed still long enough to understand it. You saw it in the way he paused after cleaning a wound, how he lingered after a fever broke, waiting to see what else the body might reveal. He didn't rush. He didn't guess. He listened. There was a man who arrived that week, coughing hard enough to bend at the waist. Each breath rattled like loose stone in a bucket. He was thin, face sunken, fingers stained yellow. You could already smell the rot on him, but he walked in without help. That meant something. He refused to lie down, insisted he was just tired, just needed something for his throat. You offered broth. He waved it off. "Nothing you can do," he said. "But I wanted to die where someone would see." The boy stood nearby, watching. You nodded. No argument, no false comfort. The man sat in the corner, hunched, breathing like a bellows drawn too tight. He didn't speak again. You laid a blanket over him when he stopped shivering. The boy lit another candle. By morning he was gone. You buried him behind the forge. No name, no marker, just a folded coat at the edge of the grave. The boy stood with you, silent. Later that night he added a new entry to the ledger. Not a line, not a mark, a shape, a small circle filled in with charcoal. He didn't explain it. You didn't ask. From then on, he used the same mark when someone came to die but not to fight. When they came to be seen, to be known, to be buried by a pair of hands that still believed the act had meaning. Winter approached. You sealed the windows with cloth. The wind pushed against the door harder each night. The fire needed more tending, and still they came. Limps turned to lameness, coughs deepened, bruises stayed purple too long. You taught the boy how to warm the blades without warping them, how to test for fever with the back of his wrist, how to know when blood loss meant the end was near, and when it simply meant you had to move faster. He remembered everything. And when you forgot something, a name, a date, the contents of a jar, he didn't speak it aloud, just handed it to you, quietly, as if it had never left your mind. The forge was no longer just your place. It was his, too. You felt it in the way he moved, not with permission, but with purpose. And you knew soon it would belong to him entirely. The snow came early, heavy, unforgiving. It clung to the eaves and pressed against the door like a beggar with no voice. The fire burned constantly now, not for comfort, for survival. Each morning you stoked it before your breath left frost on the blade. The forge walls groaned under the cold, and the water froze in its basin if left untouched too long. The boy adjusted without complaint. He rose in darkness, wrapped himself in layers too thin for the weather, and worked with numb fingers until the blood returned to his knuckles. His cough had lessened, but the rawness stayed in his throat, a reminder that warmth never lasted. He didn't ask for gloves. You didn't offer. He had passed beyond such needs. One night a knock came long after sundown. Not hurried, not frantic, just steady. You opened the door and found a man cradling another, both of them shivering so hard their teeth clicked with each breath. The carried man was barely conscious. Frost clung to his hair, his lips purple and cracked. His leg was wrapped in cloth-soaked dark. You could smell infection already, sweet and wrong. They didn't speak. You made space on the table. The boy took the wet layers, unwrapped the wound. Black skin, the flesh puffed and tight, splitting where the cloth stuck. Too late for saving. You saw it immediately, but you didn't say it. You worked. The blade was hot. The boy held the man's arms. The other man, the friend, the brother, maybe neither, stepped back, face blank with waiting. You cut quickly. The leg came away below the knee. No time for stitching, just fire, cloth, and pressure. The blood steamed into the air. The smell filled the room like sorrow. The man never woke. You buried him before dawn, the boy holding the lantern, his face lit from below, still but not cold. You didn't ask who he was. The friend left without a word. In the silence after, you noticed the boy looking at the old satchel, the one you hadn't touched in months. His eyes rested on the stitching, the worn leather flap, the tiny notch in the strap where a blade once tore it by mistake. He didn't reach for it, but you did. You brought it to the fire, opened it. Inside, the old bone-handled blade, a folded cloth with dried herbs, a scrap of paper you'd never dared to read. You handed him the blade. He took it in both hands, not with excitement, with reverence. He cleaned it slowly, oiled the hinge, sharpened the edge. Then he wrapped it again and placed it beside his own. That night he didn't sleep. You found him at the ledger, eyes scanning the old marks, finger tracing each shape. When he turned to you, he said only one thing: "When you go, I'll stay." You didn't answer. You didn't need to, because now it was true. You woke before the fire. The cold touched your chest like a hand pressed flat and patient. You didn't sit up right away, just listened to the creak of the roof beams, to the slow wind sliding against the wall, to the soft steps of the boy moving from cot to coals. He didn't know you were awake. That was fine. You watched him lift the kettle, add wood, stir the ash. Everything exactly as you'd shown him, everything steady. Your body ached in the familiar way. Not sharp, not new, just old pain, wrapped around your joints like cloth soaked in memory. You stood slowly, no rush, no knocks yet. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the light was still blue, the kind that comes before the day really begins. The boy had already laid out the tools. He turned when he heard you, no words, just a nod. You returned it. There were two visitors that morning, a woman with a broken toe and a man with a head wound half healed wrong. The boy took the first, you the second. He worked in silence, gentle, exact. You heard her laugh once, quietly. You didn't look up. Your patient winced as you realigned the brake. You tied it off. You sent him home with herbs to chew. He didn't thank you. That was normal. Later, the boy added a mark to the ledger, a single line. You saw how straight it was. That evening, the wind picked up again. The snow had started to fall sideways, not hard, but constant. The door creaked even when closed. You placed your hand on it once, as if expecting someone, but no one came. You sat beside the fire and looked at the satchel. It hadn't moved since the boy placed it beside his own. The bone-handled blade, now sharpened smooth, waited without purpose. You could feel its weight without touching it. The boy sat across from you. He had begun mending a strip of cloth, threading the needle carefully, slowly. You watched his fingers, stronger now, still thin, but steady. "You'll keep the fire going," you said. He looked up, nodded. "You'll sharpen the blades, change the dressings, burn the rags." Again, he nodded. You leaned back. The chair creaked beneath you. Your breath felt shorter tonight. Not painful, just further away. He saw it. You knew he did. You stared at the coals. "When they ask for me," you said, "you'll say I went quiet." He didn't speak. That was enough. You closed your eyes. Let the warmth settle in your chest. It didn't push back the cold. Not fully, but it softened the edges. And when the night deepened, and the fire lowered, and the sound of breath evened out between you, he stayed there. Not asleep, not afraid, just waiting. The forge would still be there in the morning. So would the blade. So would the list. But you wouldn't. And that, finally, was all right.